everyone. I didn't expect this crowd actually, because I know the news is out last Friday, so only had one day for you guys to sign up. Probably you're not attracted by my fake photo. That was that poster that's over Photoshop. So probably that is not a reason, and the talk is the reason. So before I start today's talk, I would like to very briefly introduce myself and then my research. My name is Chris Chao Su. I'm an assistant professor of emerging media studies in College of Communication. I joined BU in the year of 2021, so actually right between the pandemic. So actually this is my first time to give a talk publicly to the whole college. My research only focused on two subject matter. The first one is how people consume different media content online and how those consumption could cross very easy with each other. And so in that sense, I use a lot of tracking data to use real-time tracking data to show those consumption patterns come from online audience. The second subject matter I study on is the ecosystem this whole consumption operates. So how does consumption happens and where that happens. So the second research agenda is actually today's topic. I will focus on media platforms. So I take a look at the design and architecture of media platforms and try to understand how the different characteristics of the platform may lead to different consumptions that potentially affects people's behaviors they have online. So let's get to today's talk. So again, today's talk will focus on media platforms. Usually before this kind of talk, people try to get you some so-called literature review. I mean, most of the people in this class take literature review. So I also want to give you some kind of review in terms of how people study media platforms, what have been studied. So I asked ChatGPT. I mean, nowadays everyone asks ChatGPT, and so I asked the same question. Could you tell me the main scholarship, the research tools, theories, and the methodologies that other people have been studied on media platforms in communication research? To be honest, I'm not very happy with the answer because this is what I feature. There's both qualitative and quantitative research, and then people study media effects, those kind of things. So I still, take a time to think and try to share with you my opinion, what people have been studying on media platforms. So based on my research and what I've read about media platforms, of course there are different research areas regarding to platform. For example, some people focus on media effects, which means how the consumption of different media content could take effects on one's behaviors, or social well-being, social capital building. And also, in relation to that, some people study exposure, reception, and consumption. In general, the whole mechanism when you start to consume something on the platform, and then at the moment you start to be affected by that consumption behaviors, how you receive that information, and how that exposure and the reception could lead to different consumption behaviors, and which leads to other change in other behaviors. Also, like in political communications, people study media platforms, see how participants in protests or social movement, they use different media platforms to coordinate, to collaborate with each other, and better empower their participation in different social movement. Also, there are a lot of studies from a critical perspective. For example, platformization from a bunch of scholars who based in University of Amsterdam and University of Toronto. They try to understand the political economy logic behind media platforms. Also, some epistemology, sociology, and philosophy studies. To my very initial reading, I think this subject matter has some issues. First, most of the studies actually conducted in the Western context. It's something that we will address later. Second, in terms of methodology and data they used, they probably most of the time engage with some mainstream approaches. For example, they use survey data, self-perceived data, social media data a lot. People are using social media data, but because the change of Twitter API, so the whole scholarship will change because of that. So it's very fragile if we only use one type of social media data, of course. Also, like people use user-centric tracking data. For example, the first project I just introduced, I use a lot of user-centric tracking data based on some commercial companies and how to use the monitoring and tracking data to understand the actual behaviors and consumption patterns. So from all those research areas, the data and the method they use in this subject matter, they use to answer different questions. So in this talk, I want to actually engage with two different research questions, and that come with these two studies, two empirical studies I want to use today. So in general, both studies trying to speak with the idea of decoding the platform dynamics, which means I try to understand the design architecture, the structure of information that is embedded at the back end of the platform. Also, I try to introduce some uncommonly employed data set, because that are very well used in the field to study media platforms. So the first one is called the citation and co-citation network behind fact-checking service. The second one is called public-facing policies, community guidelines released by platforms. So before I introduce each of the study, I want to very quickly show you what I mean by studying the subject matter here. So the first study is actually about fact checkers. So I don't know how many of you actually use fact checkers. This is a very common or one of the most prevalent fact checkers in the state, factcheck.org. And this website is a subset of factcheck.org we call ScienceCheck, which only focus on the science-related claims. So when someone made an argument or make a speech about some science information, and there may be some of them are misinformation, and then this website will collect those information and try to fact check whether this information is true or is true or is not is fake. So this is what the first study focused on, the fact checking website. And when you look at any of the fact checking content online, when you try to read those articles, sometimes you will find there are some text or phrases that are highlighted, or in that way, it's called anchor text that can be linked to another website or web page, sometimes internally, sometimes externally, which means the producer of these fact-checking articles, they try to refer to other articles and to back up their opinions or trace the origins of the misinformation, and which means they use other information to structure this piece and present the content to you at the end. So all those anchor texts and those hyperlinks is the focus of my first study. As for the second studies, so this is an example of the second study. I don't know how many of you actually take the time to read those policies has been published or released by those media platforms. For example, this is a policy called community guidelines. Basically, all the media platforms you consume, they actually have this section called community guidelines, trying to list out those, it's called code of conduct, trying to tell you what are those content you should not post, what are those behaviors you are encouraged to do, and what are those responsibilities you will take if you post something. So this is an example of those community guidelines you can find on TikTok. I personally not using TikTok, but I know TikTok is one of the most popular platform nowadays. So in my second study, I focus on the public-facing policies in the case of community guideline to understand how TikTok fabricates or composed those policies, and what kind of story or narratives they're trying to convey to its readers, and in which way they be able to create a governance framework and tell you what you should do, what you should not do. Okay. However, we know probably 90% of us won't read these community guidelines. So this study is not related to any consumption behaviors, but instead I want to introduce to you how TikTok are trying to present to you. Okay. So also as a very short Okay, so for the second study, I basically collect the script or those community guideline pages from a Wayback Machine. So basically, Wayback Machine trying to record any single web pages you could be able to say online. So you probably not noticed, but there's a million scripters constantly working online, the most intensive and hardworking labors at internet to try to skip all those web pages for you. So this is where my data come from. All right, let's get back to the slides. So in the first study, I tried to do a content analysis, try to understand those hyperlinks, or here I call it citations. So this is what the citation refers to. The citation is being employed and used in those fact-checking content. And I conduct a hyperlink analysis to understand how different external sources has been used or referenced to those fact-checkers. And then I propose this ecological approach to understand structure with information presentation, which means although there's different ways people to present information online, however, the structure of how information presented, especially in this case, would make a change, or in other ways, to make a change towards whether the fact check to be effective or not, and who find these fact checkers to be effective. For the second study, I used a longitudinal lexical analysis. Basically, I track and script every single community guidelines published by TikTok from the day TikTok was launched in the US until in 2021. And I conduct a network analysis to understand the different values and different regulations has been embedded in those community guidelines, and use a network analysis to present how the different values and regulations are embedded through these public-facing policies. So first, let's take a look at the first study. This study is a project funded by the Rita Island Foundation, and a bunch of our scholars here. Actually, Dr. Cummings is here. He's also a co-author of this paper. And so including me, myself, and then Dr. Grace G, Dr. Arunima Krishna, Dr. Jim Cummings, Dr. Rossini Vaskis, and Dr. Harsh Taneja, and Dr. Michelle Amazon. So first, I want to introduce some very simple background about fact checkers. Their study has demonstrated very few people actually consume fact checkers. So there's a relatively small amount of direct traffic to fact checkers. If you try to get some empirical data about what people consume every day, you'll find it's less than 1% of US population actually go to fact check and consume any piece published by fact checkers. And even, so there are few people visit fact checkers. People who visit usually have two tendencies. The first one is those people usually are ideologically left-leaning. So left-leaning person find to visit fact checker more frequent. And secondly, those who actually share fact-checking content on social media tends to only share those content that align with their pre-existing partition attitudes. For example, I agree with the Democratic Party, so that I will only share those fact-checking content that align with my partition attitudes. Secondly, although many studies have studied architecture and design of platforms as a primary factor that potentially prevent people from consuming as a factor that contributing to the spread of misinformation, which means if you change the format or the presentation of information displayed on the website, potentially you can either discourage or encourage people to consume the information provided on that website. However, there are very few studies actually examined the architecture and design of platform that potentially prevent people from consuming fact checkers. So this is a simple background about the first study. So what can make effective fact checkers? In a high choice media environment, fact-checking websites may more effectively debunk misinformation if they could be able to fulfill some criteria. So here I summarize two most important criteria that's been discussed a lot in the literature. and then serve as a theoretical basis for this study. So, for example, the inclination of visitors to read online text content carefully that associates someone's intention and the motivation to use their fact checkers. If you have no intention and if you have no motivated to use fact checkers, of course you won't use fact checkers. It's just common sense. And secondly, the media literacy and elaboration of the audience can also potentially affect the consumption of fact checkers. For example, if you're not sorry, let me say this way. So if you come from different culture, okay, whether you know English, but English is not your native language, okay, and there's a fact checker or other websites, they offer both English and a second language. Okay, that means if you go to read an article, publish an article, you can very easily switch language from English to another language, right? So that potentially reduce the cognitive efforts you need to elaborate and understand the content published by those fact checkers. So if their websites they actually offer multiple language options, and then you are more likely to read those fact checkers. Basically, it's easy for you to understand, comprehend, and elaborate. Okay, so those two criteria are considered as the criteria for effective fact checkers. So in series, we argue that user will be more likely to consume fact checkers if it can fulfill the two conditions. First is the fact checkers trying to produce or publish more content that is attitudinally congruent with your own pre-existing beliefs. Secondly, the information that's been presented at the fact checkers is very familiar to you, which means, for example, this fact checker very frequently cites news media from all those democratic mainstream media. And if you are a democratic person, then for yourself, you're more likely to read those fact checkers because they use resources that you are familiar with. So in that sense, we believe that everyday practice of media consumption is also a major factor that affects whether people want to use fact checker or not. So based on those theories and literature, so today, because it's mainly based to our students, so I won't spend too much time on those theories. But in short, we use the motivated reasoning theory, which comes from a psychological perspective, and a selective perception to understand those two major arguments made here as the basis to understand fact checking and citations. So we argue that there are ways for fact checking to reinforce or empower these readers based on the reinforced through citations. So if I cite more external resources from those news websites that you are familiar with, then more likely the readers will go to consume it because I agree with you. So that's what we call the reinforcement through citations. So therefore, the reference web outlines matter in fact checker web page based on how closely audience typical anti-consumption patterns align with references, as well as the design features and topics covered by those web outlines. So what I mean by citations, I want to give you a very concrete operational definition of the citations with example in this study. If you see those these small photos here, whoever can see it. So if you know HTML language, once you see an anchor text, that is a text usually highlighted in blue and could be clicked and then direct you to an external website, this is what is written at the back end. So you have a hyperlink associated with some text in an article, and then you have something called anchor text, basically a name, an argument, or a phrase, or certain vocabularies that we use to link those hyperlinks. So this is where our data come from. So we focus on the citations in the fact-checking articles. We collect the hyperlinks and also the anchor text from those fact-checking articles, and we consider that as a backup reference when people try to make some argument. They use those hyperlinks to back up your argument. And if a reader click into those references, they will be linked to other external sources. For that, action will consider as an elaboration or further reading of the resources that be included in the fact check content. So based on that, we try to understand not just citations, but also how different citations may appear more frequently together compared to other citations. So that we call it co-citations or co-citation network. Because for example, if there's a tendency for the producers of fact checkers, they try to use citations or references typically from a bunch of particular specialized web outlets, right? So in that case, some citations may more frequently appear compared to other citations together, right? So that's called citations. Operationally speaking, we refer to the occurrence of the two or more citations come together. So in that sense, we try to understand the fact-checking consumption environment as a backbone of the fact checkers. So we have 3 research questions to get this study. The first one, we try to understand when debunking misinformation or they try to fact check those informations. Do fact-checking articles selectively cite or co-cite some references? Where there's a selectivity that could be observed from the practice of using citation outlets in fact-checking content. Second, we want to understand what factors could affect the choice of citations and co-citations and misinformation that's being fact-checked. In our study, we focus on the science-related misinformation because we use all the data from ScienceCheck. So we focus on 4 major factors. The first one is the linguistic factors, and then the topicality of web entities. What kind of websites do we use to link to those citations? Second, the website features, whether they use multimedia element, whether they have audio, video used in that fact-checking content. And fourth is the news attribute. What kind of, if this is a news website, what kind of news website it is, whether it's a mainstream news media or it's a super partisan news media, so those news attributes. And the third, we want to understand when fact-checking specific topic of science misinformation, with certain set of citations and co-citations be selectively referenced compared to other citations or pair of citations. So here come with a number of factors we have observed and examined in this study. From the audience intention and motivation perspective, we'll focus on the topic of those citation outlines, the partisanship, the news category, and the organization institution. So what kind of organization institution is behind those citation outlines. Second, from the design, affordance, and the presentation of information perspective, we'll focus on the multilinguality, which means whether there are multiple languages offered or available, and those citation outlines. Some design perspective, for example, whether on those outlines there's a presence of human faces, the presence of different genders, racial groups, and age groups, and also the content layout, also modality. So in this presentation, I won't go over both of them, but I will try to show some results and focus on some of the most important factors here. So in terms of data and method, first we focus on the ScienceCheck website, which is the website below factcheck.org, only focus on science information fact-checking. And we collect all those fact-checking content between March 31st, 2017 until November 2nd, 2021. Then we click all the science-related claims and how those claims has been fact-checked. In total, we've got 361 pieces of articles from the ScienceCheck.org website. And second, we use text mining to scrape all the hyperlinks and anchored web entities that have been identified in the 361 fact-checking articles. So as long as there is text that is highlighted and then we link to external resources, we script it out, and then we use other scraping to collect all the content that has been reflected at that citation pages. And the third, we based on that, so in total from the second step, in total we got 20,216 hyperlinks. So it's actually a very common practice. Please.
Yeah, just a question. So sometimes with these fact-checking sites, they will point to both good information, but they might also point to bad information, saying
Yes.
this is where we saw the misrepresentation. Are you excluding those, or are these all combined?
So we do use some data cleaning to exclude first those biased navigations. Also, in the second study, beyond this one, we use some supervised machine learning to categorize different sites into different categories. That, in terms of the purpose of referencing external sources. But that was actually not presented today, but I would like to talk more if you're interested. So first, let's go back to the data method. It's a very common practice for fact-checking content to use external sources. You say, with that 300-something articles, we got more than 20,000 hyperlinks. However, those 20,000-something hyperlinks are not unique. Okay, all those 20,000 hyperlinks that come from these 2,027 citation outlets. So when I say citation outlets, I mean the domain of that hyperlink, because for the same citation domain, they may have different web pages, and different web pages may be referenced several times by the same fact-checking content. So after we clean those hyperlinks and only zoom into those website domains, we find all of them actually come from these 2,027 domains. So from here, you may have this feeling that indeed, or potentially, there's a degree of selectivity when people trying to compose or write fact-checking content and publish online. Also, we do some human coding in terms of all the factors I've mentioned previously. So I'm not going to spend too much time talking about human coding. So we hire some graduate students, and we spend time to fine-tune the intercode availability and to code all those 2,027 web domains. And then we match the 2,027 web domains and their coding results back to that 20,000 something hyperlinks after the coding was done. Lastly, we do some network analysis, try to understand how those citation outlines were used in the fact-checking articles, and whether some citation out domains are most frequently linked to each other compared to other pairs of citation domains. So here come with some more descriptive analysis. I just want to show you what we find. First, which text, those highlighted text in the fact-checking articles, which text needs citation? Okay, what kind of content? When the fact checkers try to publish, and then they will use external resources to back them up, or they try to elaborate it more using citations. So this word cloud, the larger front actually refers to the frequency, the size of the keywords refers to the frequency that's been linked to hyperlinks in my database. So you can see it's very tightly associated with those hot topics, social issues, political issues. For example, coronavirus, of course, climate change, and some relates to the U.S. presidential election. For example, the players by 2022 is actually profiles of outside groups that plan to spend money to influence the 2022 elections. So it's an archive that been very frequently cited in this fact-check website. Now, who use the citations? So what kind of when people mention some political figures, right, then more likely they will use citations to refer to different arguments or different evidence. So in our data set, we find most of the citations, almost 1/3, dealing with the former President Donald Trump, and also some of those very famous person in the past in the pandemic. Also a lot of political figures. Then, what kind of misconsumption that has been used citation more often compared to others? So in our database, we find vaccination has actually the most is the misconsumption that mostly engage with citations compared to other misconsumptions. But of course, all of them actually are hot topics and then important topics in the time period when we collect our data. Then, what finally get to this question? Who has been cited? So what are those citation networks that have been used in the fact-checking content? I think you cannot recognize any of the website here, right? Before I show you the pie chart, I want to very briefly mention this is a power law distribution, which means the small portion of citation outlines dominates the most citations that we use in the fact-checking content. So if we zoom into the most cited citation outlines, we can find actually almost more than 1/3 of them come from factcheck.org, which is the parent website of SciCheck. So they very frequently cite things internally. So if I want to make up my argument, I go to my parent website, the factcheck.org, and I refer information that has been debunked or checked previously. Other top cited websites, including like FDA, CDC, and also some social media platforms, mainly Twitter and Facebook, and the White House, and WHO. So those government sites, social media sites, mainstream media, and research hubs, also like including some scientific journals like Nature and NEJM. So for my colleagues, what we have published do have some critical implications, so maybe citing this fact-checking content in practice. So because factcheck.org occupy more than 1/3 of the citation here, so we move factcheck.org, the internal citation from database, and only focus on those external citations. So here, I first zoom in the top 100 citation outlines, and what those and the frequency of the citations log transformed in order to better show the difference. And then I'll mark each of the citation outlines based on some affordance and design features of each of the citation. So for this one, we use different colors to mark different organizations that behind those citation outlines. So the result is just educational and research institutions, universities, take the majority of the citations, citation outlines that we identify in this study, and followed by government and the federal agency and news organizations, and then for-profit companies and corporations, and lastly is non-profit organizations. There are two institutions have very frequently cited in our data set. One is the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. The second one is the Food and Drug Administration. Also, there are two scientific journals that have been cited very frequently in our data. One is Nature, the other one is Cites. Then we also do the same descriptive analysis using the linguistic the language availability. So whether there are different language available and those citation outlines. So the result actually suggests that most of the citation outlines have English version only, and only 10% of those outlines have offered a second language and made it available to its readers. We also actually did some similar research in terms of whether some age groups or race groups or gender groups have been featured and those outlines, but for the time issue, I will skip for those parts for this talk. Lastly, I want to demonstrate to you is the political affiliation. So whether if this site or citation outlines be recognized as a news outlines, then we try to check whether there's a political partisanship associated with that outline. So the result is most of the citation outlines that embody fact-checking content are neutral and left-leaning website. Okay, so more favor the Democratic Party. So the last descriptive result I want to demonstrate you is focus on a small sector of news media. So there's a bunch of news media also frequently cited in the fact-checking content. However, there's only 34.4% of the outlines are actually news outlines. So it's definitely not the most, the biggest category as we find in those citation outlines. But within that 30.4% of citation outlines, they are news outlines. So we try to understand for those news outlines, in terms of the organization behind those news outlines, whether there are some different focus in terms of their audience log. So for example, we differentiate between the legacy news and the digital news. So for legacy news means those websites actually has a print newspaper or television associated with that website, like ABC or Fox News. there's a physical institution behind those websites. For digital native news websites, refers to those websites that only have a digital version. They don't have any physical institution behind that. And then we differentiate different news outlets based on this audience scope, whether they focus on a local audience, national audience, and foreign audience. So most of the news has been cited in the fact-checking content actually focus on national news, and then 30%, below 30% focus on local news, and below 20% focus on foreign news. And we also differentiate different news categories, whether this is a news website only reporting political news, or is reporting political news and other news as well. So for the first category, that means this is site only focused on those hot news or political only news. We find a very small set of websites actually only focus on political news, and the majority of them reporting both political news and other news as well. And lastly, we check each news website's political affiliation using two fact checkers. So with fact checkers to study fact checkers. So we use the media bias factchecker.com and all slides and try to cross-validate results for human coding. So you may wonder that, so Chris, you get all those data scraping, you get so many data, what you can conclude. So what is your funding? So here I will very quickly introduce my funding for this study. So first, we try to use different factors to predict the citations. So we use a multi-level regression to predict the frequency of citations being used in our data set. As you can see, we have, for example, the categories of different citation outlines, whether it's a legacy institution, it's a dummy variable, whether it has different linguistic diversity, and also the news and political attributes associated with those citation outlines. So in general, we find for online outlines are more likely to be cited in the fact-checking articles if first, it actually offers more than English. So you have affording multilinguality in those citation outlines. Secondly, there are more chance for those websites if it's linked to a legacy institution. For example, is Fox News, the website of Fox News, or the website of ABC News. They have larger chance for them to be cited in the fact-checking articles. And third, if in those, I have to skip the coding schema for the third funding, but we did code it whether multiple racial groups, ethnicity groups has been presented in those citation outlines. So we find if the citation outlines featured more than one racial groups, then there's a larger chance for them to be included in the fact-checking articles. And fourth, if the citation outlines is targeting a national news audience, they have larger chance. Lastly, if the citation outline is more linear, more likely to be used or cited in those fact-checking content. So then we also do the co-citation networks, which means once there are two citation outlines has been referenced simultaneously and one fact-checking articles, then there's a connection that's built up between those two citations because they showed up together in the same content. First, this is what the citation network look like. So we analyze what those 20,000 something, what those 2027 citation domains. So the number of nodes, which are the little pinpoint here, are the citation outlines. And in total, we find 55,030 connections among those citations. So it's actually a very sparse graph, which means many of the citations, they just co-occurred at least once or two times in a few articles. Not very frequently co-occurs together. It's also polar distribution. However, interesting part is we run some cluster analysis and those citation networks based on how they co-connected with each other. We find clearly there are 9 hubs or 9 sub-communities in this network. So indeed, there are some citation outlines are more frequently appeared together compared to others. So these are the 9 communities identified in our citation networks. The first one is the mentioned media news and authorities, for example, the CDC website. The second one is more COVID-related health institution, where topic focused. The third one is those advocate groups. and followed by the professional academic groups, and the social media, and the health and pharmaceutical corporates. Those are for-profit companies, but in the medical industry. And also, there's a bunch of sites that are political ID sites, also has been cited together a lot compared to other reference that we use in our fact-checking content. And international media, so once there's one international media has been cited in an article, there's a big chance for them to be cited again using other international media in the same fact-checking content. And lastly is the local price. So if this is a fact-checking article focused on the misconsumption that is regionally or locally, so there's more chance they will cite local news to fact-check that misinformation. So this, so in order to understand how the different design affordance associated with the citation outlines, associated with the co-citation likability, we also did a MRQAP, which is short for the multiple regression quadrant assignment procedure. Basically, we have different networks and try to find how the networks associate with each other. So, for example, if these two sites are both considered over English, Chinese, and Japanese, so then there has a one connection built up between these two subsets because they both have their linguistic feature that's for the two separate sets. And so we use the different factors or design features to contrast this network among citation outlines. And then we use those networks to predict the core citation network to identify in fact-checking content. So in general, this is what we find. So this is the result of the MRQAP analysis. So we find categories and legacy institution matters for the core citation network, which means if you belong to the same category, and if both citation outlines have the physical institution behind those outlines, they're more likely to be cited together. And second, the increased diversity, the use of multimedia, and the number of racial groups has been featured, and the web page also matters in terms of whether some different citation outlines being used together in the same fact-checking content. And also the legacy size, national size, and the political bias will also decide to affect whether some citations will be cited together. So here come with our conclusions. So first, we do find that there's a tendency for selective citation and core citations in the fact-checking content. And to determine the tendency of selectivity, we find design interface matters, the multilinguality, multi-ethnicity could potentially affect the selective citation or core citation practice in those fact-checking content. The multiple media elements also leads to selective core citations. So if you use, if both websites tend to use a lot of multimedia elements together, they're more likely to be core-cited together to fact-check the same content. The latency linkage also matters. So if you are linked with a physical institution or established institution, the more likely you'll be used as a citation in those fact-checking content. And secondly, we find news attribute matters, which means if you are a mainstream news media or other kind of news media, then if this news media is targeting on national news and linked with some physical institutions, then more likely they'll be used in the citation and core citation networks. Secondly, we find fact-checking sites are more likely to be selective site and core site live leading websites. So very clearly we identify this tendency in our data set. So last, so I will give you some very so-called abstract conclusion at this moment. So we argue that the infrastructure of online news consumption environment may be responsible for the selective exposure rather than individual news consumption behaviors. So in that case, we think fact-check per se, in terms of how fact-checking content is composed, produced, and created at first place, may be also considered as a selective behavior in nature. So it's not just the audience, they selectively consume, expose, or perceive fact-checking content, but the production of fact-checking content may also lead to a certain degree of selectivity in the content management process. How much time do we have? 15 minutes? Actually, I prepared a second study, so, and I will try to finish this study very quick. How many of you actually see this in your life? Okay, once you open the app, right, you are told there's an update in this in TikTok, and do you agree or not agree? If you click no more, if you click disagree, they will say no, you cannot use the app anymore because you disagree with the policy, right? So this is what the second study focused on. So we're trying to understand those public-facing policies or the documents that are delivered by those media platforms to an audience, but most of the time are being ignored by the readers of audience, and how they set up those values regulations, those public-facing policies. So the title of this project is called Shifting Platform Values in Community Guidelines, Examine the Evolution of TikTok's Governance Frameworks. So it's not alone for you, like it's not surprising that people actually not reading those policies. None of us read those policies. So this study finds majority of the experimental participants, they never read those update notifications or those community guidelines or privacy policies that are supposed to be read by readers. So this is the example of our study subject. So what the unit analysis? This is actually a TikTok community guideline that was published by the December 10, 2018. So first, they will usually use a proclamation to start this paragraph. They want to create, they want to construct creative and expressive environment, and they want you feel safe and friendly. And then they come with a certain a list of content that are prohibited to post or to share at that platform. For example, in this case, it comes with 9 categories in a list of the content that was prohibited in this platform. So, however, this version of the community guidelines has substantially changed in early January 2022 because there's a bunch of legal lawsuits, also some discussion on social media regarding the child safety and the data privacy issue about TikTok. So they actually published a extended version of this community guideline compared to the very early days of those community guidelines. For example, they give a very clear definition what they mean by dangerous individuals and organizations, what they mean by terrorists. Okay, so each of the categories, the list has been extended, and then they have more lists included in this community guideline, and then they give a very clear definition of that. So in general, all those public-facing policies has 2 categories, or 2 types. One is a formal legal binding policy document, such as terms of service or privacy policy. Those documents are usually reading is a very abstract and difficult to read with, because those documents are not most of the time facing the audience. They are trying to avoid some responsibilities or legal responsibilities from the government or law enforcement. And the second type category is informal or normative policy documents, such as the community guidelines. They use those policies to define what are those content you're supposed not to post, and what are those behaviors you are encouraged to do, and what are those vibrate or spirit we like in this platform. So usually those documents are written in more human language. Okay, there's a relatively larger chance for you to read because this language is more accessible. So I will skip this. So in this study, we try to understand the corporate construction of the platform values that we read in these community guidelines. So when there's a community guideline was published, they usually try to highlight some values and also regulations, or some highlight some content that really want their readers to understand and to follow. Okay. So for doing that, we script and analyze the community guidelines on TikTok between 2018 and 2020, and then we try to match and identify the changes and the data pool linguistically, relationally, and semantically. For example, what is the different vocabularies, words, and language being used in one version of that community guidelines, and how the different values are highlighted or co-highlighted together in some time points of the published policies. So here is a very comprehensive code book. So it's very quick to show you what are those different values encoded from those public-facing documents, including engagement, authenticity, community, privacy, accountability, fairness, and self-determination. So this code book is composed based on the existing literature and also some explorative empirical study we rate or qualitative rate from those community guidelines. So what do platform values actually look like? For example, this sentence may deeply understand the psychological distress that abusive content can have on individuals, and we do not tolerate abusive content or behaviors on our platform. So for those sentences, we identify 3 different values. One is engagement, second is community, and third is safety, based on what the different values actually has been consulted through this sentence. And then based on that, also try to code the valence of that values. While the sentence trying to pro or against the values has been coded from that sentence. For example, in terms of engagement, they actually try to against the engagement by saying you should not post abusive content. Okay, so this is the coding process look like. So very quickly for the messages and data, we split all the screenshot of TikTok community guidelines. In total, we got 25,641 different versions of community guidelines. Sometimes those changes are very invisible. So they just change 1 or 2 words, will replace certain vocabulary with other vocabularies, will change the way of the expression. But to make sure we have the holistic understanding about the evolution of community guideline policies, we script everything. But if we tokenize all those different community guidelines, which means we break a document into unique sentence and remove all those redundant sentences, only focus on those unique sentences, in total we'll be able to only get 5,429 sentences. So sometimes those platforms, they just shuffle around different sentences. So use this sentence today, use the other sentence the other day, because they have some values or there's a purpose of doing that. Then we use a hybrid digital method to analyze these corpus. So first is a lexical analysis to understand the word level or sentence level changes. So very implicitly, we try to say when there's a word change, where the word change to be difficult to read to easy to read, or it will change from an easy vocabulary to a more difficult vocabulary. Also, we measure we identify the platform values. So using the human coding, we see for each sentence what are those values has been mentioned and what is the valence of each values. And third, also do the qualitative thematic analysis, focus on those a few documents that has substantial, very significant changes over the years. So here actually I have some very descriptive results. So to put it short, so first, those platform policy is indeed changing. Okay, this is the first result we have. They're not changing. It's not that they're not changing at all. They're actually changing a lot, and they keep changing. However, though many of the changes are invisible, so not highlighted, or they just change using some similar words, have similar meanings, but different way to present the same meanings. In general, we find they tend to put those policy documents to be longer and longer. And in terms of the lexical analysis, so we first use a linguistical measure to understand the readability of each sentence. So there's an equation here to how to measure readability. So I'm not spending too much time here. However, result is over the time, is much more difficult to read. Sorry, I read it different. Much more difficult to read over time. So it's longer and longer, and also they tend to use some vocabularies that are easy to read. And secondly, they lower the lexical complexity, which means although it's more and more difficult to read, however, the vocabularies tend to be more and more similar. So they use some same batch of vocabulary, although those vocabularies are difficult to read. So the complexity of each policy document tends to be less and less complex, but difficult to read. There are also 2 major updates we identified using this approach, because we examined all the changes involvement through the years by day. So we find two major updates, and then we qualitatively examine those major updates, and also do some statistics analysis on that. Here, very quickly, I also want to show you how those values may coexist together over the years. So based on the cluster analysis, we find that some values are more likely to cluster together, which means they more frequently mentioned at the same paragraph, at the same sentence, or in the same subsections. So including engagement, safety, community, and accountability. So all of them are very frequently highlighted in those document pages, but not for fairness, privacy, and self-determination, also authenticity. And then we try to identify the most distinctive policy document based on the characteristics of those value networks. So here, I'm not going into all those network statistics here, but in general, we find 4 versions that make the most difference compared to 4 other versions in the network. So the first one is 2018 December, and 2020 January, 2020 December, and 2022 March. So those are the most distinctive policies in terms of how they include the different values regulations in their policy document. Then we did task dependency analysis. So basically, we use the time point 1 network to predict time point 2. And then we use both time point 1 and time point 2 to predict time point 3. And then we do the same thing to say whether the early version community guidelines has an impact on the later version of community guidelines, whether they always inherited the different values from the early versions, or they actually make different changes because of some other social factors or some advocates relates to those values. So first, we find the term point 1 is significant associated with term point 2 and term point 3 separately. So the second and third term points is indeed very similar to term point 1. Term point 2 is also significantly related to term point 3. However, the coefficient is very large, but it's different compared to the linear regression. So this is actually not significant large in this kind of analysis. However, if we control, so we put both term point 1 and term point 2 to predict term point 3, which means we control term point 1 and only consider effects of the second term points and the third points. We find the effects from term points 1 to the third version has diminished. So it does not exist anymore, which means those document changes actually the first term point change the second point, but the second point changes third point, well, by altering some different vocabularies or values that actually is opposite to a term point 1. So contradictory with the term point 1. The same thing we can do for the term point 4. So here we actually find some very interesting paths. The first one is called the mediation path, which means for one version to have impact and the other version is not they have a direct impact, but instead they have a jump over impact. So the first impact something in between and impact the other thing. So I call it mediation path. The second one is called inversion path, which we find out between the relationship between term point 1, term point 2, and term point 4, which means the between term point 1 and term point 4, although it's still similar, but the different values that has against or pro in those documents has been reversed in the first version or the last version we identified in our database. So for that, I call it the reversion path. The last one is the confounding path, which means the impacts from the earlier version to the later version could be either weakened or strengthened because of the change of the values and the change of the lexical characteristics of the sentence. So this is the, sorry for the time issue, I don't have time to very clearly explain each of the statistics analysis, but very quickly go with some of the findings we have. So first, we find, I have to skip those qualitative results. So in conclusion, first, we do find in terms of the evolution of the TikTok and its governance framework as displayed in the community guidelines, we find the changes could be identified through both lexical and discursive levels. And second, we find those platform policies indeed trying to create a so-called particle character facing to the public. So they are based on Wang Yi's and Post article. So this is something called dominant platform imaginary, which means there's an imagination the platform wants you to have through their community guidelines. And third, there are substantial values embedded in those platform policies, including engagement and the community, and become more and more important over the years. And third, indeed, there's a tendency for those platform, TikTok in particular, to selectively review and execute its governance frameworks by changing its vocabularies and the way they compose those words and sentences. And last, we find the three mechanisms in the past-dependent analysis. And lastly, we argue there's a temporal dimension for the platform policy to evolve over time. All right. So this is my second study, and thank you, everyone.